Welcome to this episode of Bright to Stormy, the everyday podcast with Olli Schmidt. Today we come to you with a special episode as we have as our guest Gisela Erler, the founder of PME Familienservice, the company that produces this podcast. Her new book was released on April 8th, 2024, Democracy in Turbulent Times for a Politics of Being Heard. And that's what we want to talk about. But before we dive in, a few words about you, Gisela. In your early 20s, you co-founded the legendary Munich-based Trikonts Publishing House. Now a music publisher, it was in the 60s and 70s one of the most well-known publishing houses of the left-wing protest and alternative movement. You are also the publisher of the much-discussed Mother's Manifesto from 1986, which sparked important debates about the role of mothers and equality. You've also worked as a family researcher at the German Youth Institute, and in 1991 you began building PME Familienservice by providing daycare mothers to female employees at BMW. Today, PME Familienservice is the largest service provider for employee support in the DACH region. Your passion for social participation then eventually led you to the position of State Councillor for Civil Society and Civic Participation in the Baden-Württemberg state government from 2011 to 2021. And today we're talking about your current book, as I've already mentioned, Democracy in Turbulent Times for a Politics of Being Heard, and about how our democracy can manage to withstand current challenges and why citizens should be included in political decisions and how they can be included at all. Dear Gisela, welcome to our podcast and thanks for taking time to talk with us today.
Yes, thank you. Happy to.
Thanks for being here with us today. Notably, among other reasons, you're here because you are the respected founder of the PME Family Service. From humble beginnings, the PME Family Service has evolved and now proudly stands as one of the largest and most trusted employee assistance services across the DACH region. Your journey has obviously been filled with various experiences, but a lot has happened before this achievement too. Now, maybe let's take a stroll down memory lane, have a closer look at the time before that, and delve into how the PME Family Service was born and came about. You started your career at the German Youth Institute, correct?
Yes, that's exactly how it is, especially without counting the impactful era of revolutionary publishing house foundations starting back in the year 1967. Indeed, I founded two groundbreaking publishing houses then, Trikonts-Verlag and Frauenoffensive. Those were considered startups too, but I've been formally employed and working diligently in my specialized field of expertise since 1974 at the prestigious German Youth Institute, focusing predominantly on the imperative subject of daycare.
Of course, I didn't want to omit mentioning the publishing house's earlier founding.
Yes, I believe it was back in 1967, around the time when I was only 21 years old. As strange as it may sound, it was always the same story playing out. Curiously, I always, quite unintentionally, found myself becoming a founder whenever there arose a need for something that didn't yet exist. Back then, in a surprising absence, there simply wasn't any publisher who professionally dealt with leftist materials, especially items like Che Guevara's writings of the time or other significant texts originating from Latin America, or even those that widely distributed what was commonly referred to as the Wall Bible. It was during that time I felt deeply that someone must step up and do it. And that's precisely how I got involved, along with my existing partner at that time. And yes, much later, while working with Family Service, I confronted a similar situation. Unbelievably, there was no childcare available. In stark reality, there was exceptionally little accessible. And what was on hand was only for the very socially weak, disadvantaged, single mothers, but regrettably not for the normally working population. There were neither day mothers nor nannies. It was all semi-legal and unmonitored with no quality standards. And then I stumbled into it through my work as a family researcher because BMW had the idea that something could be done. And that's how it all started.
What that means is, one could say that was essentially the first time someone welcomed you with open arms and invited you, because up to that point, you really had to work against a lot of resistance.
Yes, incredibly, our publishing house foundations were sensationally successful, although you can't really say that now. I managed to brilliantly sell over 500,000 copies of Mao's Little Red Book without ever thinking that something like this could potentially happen, simply because there was such an enormous, overwhelming demand. We were extremely proud back at that crucial time, especially considering that we made no money from it. And I was so incredibly young. And the books, of course, they sharply criticize society and politics, strongly condemned the Vietnam War and such, but the response in the book trade was enormous. We always sold a lot of copies of the first books, and quite rapidly we made it onto the Spiegel bestseller lists because there was a very evident gap. It was only much later that I had to learn the hard lesson that one does not automatically land on the Spiegel bestseller list with every single book. Yes, there were always things, a great need somewhere in society, and then I probably didn't just chance upon it, but it feels that way. I said, okay, I'll do this now.
Yes, you were always at the right place at the right time.
More or less, yes.
And that's indeed also with the PME Family Service. As you just mentioned, it all started at BMW, where you then organized the childcare.
Yes, that's where our journey began. So BMW, the renowned car manufacturer, approached me while I was at a congress. They deeply respected my expertise as a seasoned family researcher, someone who had spent quite a substantial amount of time residing in America. They said, "Ms. Erler, we have a heartfelt desire to do something meaningful for our female employees, especially the remarkably qualified female engineers and so on. However, we don't want to just build a daycare facility. Firstly, the cost involved is too expensive for our budget. However, secondary to that, a majority of our employees are residing in geographic locations that are widely dispersed, even in isolated rural sections. So what feasible solution can we devise to counteract this issue?" I happened to bring back several innovative concepts from my tenure in America, drawing from major corporations like IBM and AT&T. The latter used to be the dominant phone company during that specific era, and they both utilized neighborhood services extensively. These services included prominently agencies specifically dedicated to arranging childcare providers such as day mothers and nannies. But their concentration was particularly directed towards day mothers, and they supported them by providing quality training and conducting regular checks. This system was strategically in place to ensure there was no random, uncontrolled expansion. This idea resonated with me, so I proposed it to the upper management at BMW. The concept was that we could establish an internal agency specifically for arranging childcare services such as au pairs, day mothers, and professional nannies. And the BMW daycare and such, all that came much later. And you have to imagine, I had a son born in 74, clearly earlier. There was no official place where I could have gotten a day mother. I earned too much for that. I was a single mother, but you also had to be poor. And there were no daycares anyway. We then started a parents' initiative. It was much easier back then. You had to get stuck in, but it was possible. We found a great house and the city supported us. Today, for a lagging group of parents, it's almost unreal to find a house and meet all the requirements. But from that time, I knew how difficult it was. And you couldn't even commercially arrange au pairs. It was all semi-legal. It only became basically legal after we started, once the laws had been sufficiently established. So incredibly, we were really ahead of the curve. And even back in the daycare days, we passionately conducted the first initial courses. They were astonishingly only 10 hours, which we utilized to painstakingly develop a curriculum with the women. Today, it's become a rigorous 160 hours. But at that pivotal time, it was a groundbreaking innovation to even consider the idea of qualifying childminders and so forth. You honestly can't begin to imagine how astonishingly open and utterly unorganized the field was back then. But there were even more offerings, and the childminders were not worse than today, because back then it was still seen as a pioneering deed. These were women who really wanted to do this. Back then, it wasn't so much about the money, but more about experiencing something different from their lives as housewives and wanting to do some good. It was quite different from how it was later on. Yes, that's how it started. I just wanted to say we founded the family service back then called Kinderbüro into a landscape that was still very open.
And it's a recurring theme in your incredibly fascinating life that you have always done things, created concepts that simply weren't there before. They didn't exist in that particular form. And yes, over and over, you have repeatedly started from scratch with unique, pioneering things. We're talking today, among other things, because once again, you've written an insightful book, which was officially released on the 8th of April by Verlag. Democracy in Turbulent Times, for a Politics of Being Heard, chronicles much of your journey. It should be noted that since 2011, You have actively served as a state councillor for civil society and citizen participation in the Kretschmann cabinet in Baden-Württemberg, and this book predominantly discusses that tenure. However, it goes beyond to also explore the essential question of how people's participation in democratic processes works. It delves into the methods of inspiring people for ideas, interacting with them, integrating differing opinions, providing them with a platform to voice their thoughts, and then persuasively drawing them in. Politics of being heard, what should I envision for that?
When Wilfried Kretschmann first became prime minister at that time, there was this very significant large conflict about the Stuttgart 21 project in Baden-Württemberg. Some people will surely still remember it. Tens of thousands of passionate people were really out on the streets fervently protesting against this contentious project. It was certainly possible to criticize many specific details of it. Even I found myself very critical of it. But above all, people felt strongly that no one had truly listened to their concerns. All their well-thought-out arguments were, in their humble opinion, just abruptly swept under the rug, although formally the entire process remained in order. People overwhelmingly felt that decisions were simply carelessly made over their heads. And then Kretschmann solemnly declared that he would implement a deeper policy of carefully being heard so that people feel better considered and their thoughtful opinions duly acknowledged. That was the significant starting point. And then again, somewhat paradoxically, I found myself standing in a landscape that was completely divergent from what I ultimately went on to pursue. Because until then, under the umbrella of citizen participation, even the traditionally progressive Greens understood that you simply make, for instance, democratic referendums where people passionately exercise their right to vote, or citizen initiatives where the people again vote. And there are sometimes good reasons for that, but first, you can't hold a referendum on every issue. It is a huge effort and takes 2 years, and every year hundreds of decisions are made. And second, all these forms, citizen initiatives, referendums, are initially based on conflict. A group forms and says, oh, the city administration and mayor have something terrible in mind. And then they usually don't go to the city administration and say, let's agree. But they say, we're starting a citizen initiative. I don't think that's wrong. I just want to say on both sides, then with every issue, whether it be Tesla, which is exactly the same again now, or other settlements, wind farms, and so on, a front of mistrust, opposition, and even hostility is built up. And the approach that I finally settled on was exploring how we effectively manage to find cooperative solutions to these complex issues, because usually the looming problem absolutely must be solved. Of course, numerous people have publicly stated we don't want nuclear power plants, no exceptions. So ultimately, they fully gave up on them. But most train lines or airports or other infrastructure have to be built meticulously. And then the unavoidable question arises, how specifically should they be built? We still have a significant amount of influence there. Yes, I've mainly worked hard on finding new strategies to ensure everyone is heard. Not only the unions or the citizens' initiatives are involved, but also the critics and the proponents originating from the various economy sectors. It's important to take an encompassing look around who or what speaks for and against it, and what are the identified problems. To take this broader 360-degree perspective and then take the opportunity to engage in a factual, in-depth conversation. We'll get to that significant point in just a moment because we've had substantial success with it, and we successfully transitioned that into an initiative we refer to as random citizen panels. I'll be able to succinctly explain that approach shortly. But overall, I just want to take a moment to say beforehand, I simply couldn't stop marveling. When you create a forum in which people are allowed and even required to speak with each other courteously, with moderation, and must truly listen to each other, just listen, without yelling at or viciously attacking each other, then so much constructive conversation comes out of it. And most people who actively participate are also really willing to say, aha, that's how it could possibly work. And in addition, they also develop new innovative ideas. So it's like as if you're tapping into a different source within people. And then they also start to enjoy each other's company, and they begin to say, oh, that person isn't so terrible after all. It has many impacts. And this methodology, especially through random citizen forums or citizens' councils, that's what I actually present in the book. I could tell you all about that.
We'll definitely get to that point soon. I want to briefly revisit the contentious situation where, once again, many substantial obstacles had to be overcome. In your enlightening book, there's a fascinating part where you repeatedly note that many officials were often astonished to find out that transparency ultimately creates trust, that sharing all the currently known facts enables constructive, critical discussions. And that's exactly the momentous topic you're directly talking about. Clearly, many needed convincing that this was a good idea.
Yes, this is still indeed the case today. For instance, in Baden-Württemberg, let's just say, literacy through participation in the civil service has progressed further, but that doesn't mean the old reflexes have disappeared. Civil servants aren't bad people, no. However, for centuries, they've worked diligently with expertise used to exert control. That was the norm. You had your cabinets and your processes, and you didn't approach the citizens with half-baked ideas, but instead with those that are well thought out to feel secure and to maintain the authoritarian state. Final say was the approach. No time was wasted back then. It was declared, for example, here the train will run, final say, or the highway will go here, final say, and this is the military training ground, final say. But for the past 50 years, people have been saying they want to have a say in these matters and so on. Things have changed a lot. However, many civil servants and also politicians still have the reflex that when you say we want to involve the citizens, they think, oh God, then we will have 77,000 objections and it will take 7 years. And what we really are finding, the most important experience is it doesn't take longer. It rather takes shorter or definitely not longer when you involve the citizens. But above all, you have far fewer lawsuits. So we reduce the people who still file complaints by 70% or even more because simply more people have had their say and made suggestions like, at the curve in the northern Black Forest, it must look like this, or at the bridge in the flood protection area, this and that needs to be done. So much is taken into account that most people no longer have a reason to complain. It makes the processes easier and removes a lot of hostility from society. It creates trust. I put it very simply, transparency creates trust, but civil servants and the MPs and politics too. My team is often spontaneously afraid. Now, we don't have time to listen to citizens. Always, when you don't take time today in the company to say, we'll just do it this way, there's much greater danger that you'll either make mistakes or suddenly encounter significant resistance.
This concept, perhaps we should take a closer look at it. You just mentioned random citizens. It's mainly about involving people who otherwise wouldn't participate much in politics.
Yes, exactly. That's the point. So first of all, I have to say that when I first heard about it, a professor in Germany started this, Mr. DNL. I really don't know where he was at the time. He took 20 citizens in urban planning, chosen randomly, and sat down with them. And they then made some very nice, constructive suggestions on how to, for instance, build playgrounds in a neighborhood. And I truly thought the man had lost his marbles. Why would one take randomly selected people when we have citizens' initiatives and civil society? But that's exactly it. Usually we all work with groups that are already organized. They are also important in democracy. They have an opinion, they have criticism. However, there are always many more people who are not committed, neither for nor against something. They may have different priorities or ideas, and they too need to be convinced. And these randomly selected citizens solve that problem. They are chosen in a specific manner, always ensuring that half are women and half are men, as well as representing both young and old. Besides that, they truly are from all walks of life, teachers, nurses, notaries, train drivers, you name it, people who are somehow politically interested, but often those who don't have much trust in politics and say, I want to see for myself if we're being duped here. So they are not activists. Including these voices, or rather considering them, is a very important corrective. And it must be said, this was also not clear to me. Actually, the ancient Athenian democracy already worked with these random citizens. In old Athens, there was this assembly, of course, only men and only the affluent, the rest being slaves, women, and such didn't count. But they were randomly selected, 500 people, the Council of 500. The bully, that's something I learned in Greek. And then they also used to select some government officers by lottery. Sometimes I think it wouldn't be a bad idea here too, from the available people, if you say here are 10 who would be suitable, to just draft them by lottery. And that was very respected. This lottery system then fell into oblivion, but in the Athenian democracy it was common practice for many things. And with us it is still somewhat common with juries in the courtroom, the jurors, the lay judges. Otherwise it's really not so present anymore. And it's just very, very powerful, and you can basically recreate the Swiss Popular Assembly in the marketplace with it. Just take people from all walks of life, and with that, you can capture the spirit, which to me is the most important aspect. You call them together as citizens of Stuttgart or citizens of Europe, and then the people no longer see themselves as the resident of Schlossstrasse or the resident of Belgium. Instead, they say, we are Europeans here, now let's think about Europe or about Stuttgart as a whole. And this means to take on the responsibility to think about the whole, about a segment of society or even a company. You can create that in such bodies. And it's just, I can only say again and again, sometimes you are moved to tears when people suddenly engage with or show interest in the whole, whereas before they always grimly looked at their neighboring property.
When you take a moment to look back at that enlightening experience you had wrestling with this complex concept, there was certainly often a surprisingly wide range of distinctly different opinions at the very same table that had to be delicately moderated.
Yes, of course, people certainly don't just say whatever thoughtlessly pops into their heads. The last major Citizens' Council meeting I personally experienced was primarily about nutrition at the Bundestag. I was extremely involved in meticulously ensuring that the event took place successfully, and many distinguished experts were readily available to attend. For instance, before each carefully chosen topic was discussed, stakeholders or parties stated quite determinedly, we will attentively listen to experts on why we should consider implementing a sugar tax. A member from the Free Democratic Party elaborately explains why we should not proceed as such. Engaged in a dialogue, people are not only expressing their personal feelings from within their own minds, but they also receive comprehensive information on the topic they are addressing. One example is the ongoing discussion about the renovation of the Stuttgart Opera House, where acclaimed architects passionately share why they would proceed in a particular way, and others provide counter-arguments explaining why not. So people are actively confronted with facts and perspectives regarding the issue that have been previously debated and agreed upon in the Parliament about who should ideally take the floor to speak. Equipped with this important information, the discussion amongst concerned citizens takes place, but always with the firm goal of finding a common solution or proposal. For example, citizens passionately discussing nutrition have unanimously agreed on the idea of an animal welfare penny tax and have strongly advocated for free school meals for all children living in Germany. Many said that's a matter for the federal states, but they insisted it's absolutely crucial because a lot of children, including those from wealthy families, do not necessarily have a mom at home who cooks healthy, organic meals at lunchtime. The children should eat together, and the citizens want to tell Parliament, please help ensure this is realized in Germany. How you achieve this is your problem. And indeed, as an example, a member of the SPD responded, asking why the Chancellor couldn't suggest this topic at the conference of the Ministers' President. Yes, surprisingly, so often priorities emerged that nobody expected beforehand. Before the Nutrition Citizens Assembly, everyone thought, oh gosh, people will come in and just suggest all kinds of vegan stuff, or that everything has to be organic or local. But they've responsibly acknowledged that while organic isn't bad, it has to be affordable and animal welfare should be considered, and that we desperately need better school meals. That was totally unexpected and seems it often happens quite like that. When you diligently bring such diverse people together, they always manage to bring up another relevant aspect, which isn't entirely new, but is particularly important to them. And that is the unassuming gold in these rich processes, to really take time to hear what comes directly from the people themselves who are, if you will, genuinely at the grassroots level. And it's not just for nutrition. This could apply to any issue you can think of, like migration or Tesla. For example, I am very much of the opinion that if there had been a very good participation process in place, things would look different. And then maybe Mr. Musk wouldn't have planned certain things from the beginning, and then we would have dealt with the water issue differently. So you can do this for any topic.
So it's easily seen that the quality of the decisions and ultimately the outcomes is definitely significantly higher with such participatory processes. Let's perhaps go down one level further to potentially more informal settings like the family coffee table or discussions among close friends. May I ask, what would you say are your personal ideas on how to efficiently handle differing opinions at this intimate level? After all, we seem to have, or at least it certainly feels like it, more and more escalating crises, such as the pandemic, various significant political disputes, unending wars, and there are many very different opinions at stand that we're effectively dealing with at the moment.
Yes, of course, you're absolutely right. I definitely would say I firmly believe that in certain forward-thinking companies, it's still quite feasible to foster engagement by, for example, saying that alongside the Works Council and so on, we make a concerted effort to proactively involve the employees, but in a carefully moderated way so that not everyone is, for instance, attacking each other recklessly, but instead we carefully consider who moderates, what kind of discussion rules we have firmly in place, ensuring that people actually listen to each other. This respectful environment can certainly be carefully created in a company if you sincerely want to. The hardest is, of course, managing romantic relationships and also family gatherings. You can't just buy a moderator for every family event. However, I believe that the things we're doing now, like learning to listen to other opinions quietly and then acknowledging that there's some truth in them, and then coming to a solution together that needs to be learned in many areas and can perhaps then be reintroduced into families. That worries me a lot. I also heard just now on the train, I met a lady, she was traveling to Jena where she lives and said she's very worried about the elections in the fall. She doesn't even attend family events anymore because she knows that there are so many people who think so differently that no conversation is possible. And at best, you can only talk about the coffee cream or the cake. I don't have an answer yet. But I think if we in politics and, for example, at work in local politics and in schools, tackle this topic of how we learn to tolerate other opinions and really listen to them, because, of course, we must pay attention when people all don't want migrants and ask, what can we do? What can't we do? Why it may be important after all. It can't be simply ignored. Otherwise, it will blow up in your face. And that, I believe, is the hardest to solve in private moments. Friendships are broken over this. During the Stuttgart 21 event, marriages were even divorced. Families found themselves divided into opposing camps. And while I don't want to act as if we are already there, but let's just say, particularly in America, we can clearly observe where it leads when the entire society splits dramatically into two unyielding camps. The country is somewhat precariously on the brink of civil war. They simply refuse to listen to your perspective, incessantly claiming you are wrong and declaring that everything you do is completely incorrect. And in this tormented understanding, what's actually the root behind your fear? For instance, those who are against wind turbines, they don't just find them unsightly, but they also hold strong concerns about the landscape's transformation. They ponder with uncertainty, will it now become hopelessly ugly? Or will my property value decrease significantly, and so on? There definitely needs to be open engagement with these critical issues. And of course, always there are those unfortunate ones who suffer if a loud train passes by their house. You've got a disruptive problem and are also substantially affected. The question we must consider is, can this imbalance be effectively compensated? We shouldn't blithely act as if there are absolutely no victims in play. And to honestly address who is really at a disadvantage and how to seriously deal with it, including the financial aspects and so forth, instead of just nonchalantly saying, tough luck. These viewpoints form the core of big societal debates. But on a more personal level, I strongly believe that one has to learn at work to listen to others and implement this practice in politics too, which can then be reflectively brought back into the family structure. With children, I think we've reached this point already. That's quite interesting. Children are not treated in the same way anymore. In most cases, children are listened to, especially in the normal liberal family where the child's opinion is highly valued. Parents try to compromise, sometimes even too much. And that shows how detrimental it can be when there's only giving in, because a child also needs guidance and direction. And if you simply just let it vegetate passively in front of the TV, it's definitely not really going to benefit the child. I earnestly believe that proper negotiating within the family is their democracy is actually a bit more advanced, but within the wider extended family circle and among friends, it's incredibly difficult with all the different conflicting views. We are unfortunately not quite there yet.
So it's about interacting with each other as you would with children, showing a bit more tolerance, listening to each other a bit more, approaching each other while also maintaining one's composure.
You can also say we agree to disagree, right? But obviously that's not always possible. In all these complex matters, I often discuss a concept I call leading from the front. What exactly does that mean? When I conduct a citizens' council in politics, it shouldn't just be a private closed-door session. Rather, important political decisions should ideally be made not after a sluggish 3 years, but preferably within a few months to a year. And now, once again, it's crucially important, as we can visibly see with the ongoing farmers' situation. The farmers have aggressively revolted, and understandably, the politicians are afraid of them. Now, as a result, much of the initially planned ecological progress is being hastily scaled back out of growing fear. It is then said you don't have to set aside the 4% or whatever it is, etc. This, of course, poses a significant problem because not everything was necessarily wrong. It's just that there was too little communication with the farmers and not enough sincere consideration as to how this proposed system can work efficiently for them and how they can receive justly fair prices. But now, just to do a complete reversal on all the ecology, which strikingly doesn't fit with the undeniable fact that climate change is advancing relentlessly. So, leading from the front means you still have to solve the problem and not suddenly say, oh, because there's an uproar, I have to roll my plans back. Instead, I need to find out what the compromises might look like and how it might go slower. But I cannot ignore climate change nowadays. So leading from the front, even in a company, when people say, we don't want AI now, AI, my goodness, what do we do with AI? AI is coming whether we like it or not. That means we all have to dive into AI and consider what it offers us and where we need to use it and maybe how it changes things. We must not close our eyes to it. And if people are afraid, we need to encourage them to go through with it or do something else instead. But it's not quite as straightforward as the car industry thinks it is. The Germans confidently say these electric cars are not up to par, they're no good anyway. The Chinese can't build decent cars, they're merely tin can cars. Suddenly, without any warning, you're standing in front of these so-called tin can cars and they effortlessly sweep you off the global market. That's not an acceptable outcome. You absolutely have to keep relentlessly pushing forward everywhere and not just blindly sacrifice long-term strategies because some people can't be bothered. This means a politics not just of being heard, but of progressing, not regressing.
So let's move forward together and look at how we can tackle the things that are present and find good solutions for us as a whole society.
You know, it's all about that ever-present question everyone faces. What really is the definition of a good life? It's really not always that clear-cut. For instance, despite my old age, I still find joy in driving, even though I'm rapidly nearing 80. And just by the way, you should probably test me once in a while to see if I can still legally drive. I'd willingly surrender my driver's license if I couldn't drive safely or well anymore. But then what really is the measure of a good life? Out in Copenhagen, people who used to eagerly drive into the bustling city would tell me, if you're between 20 and 50 and blessed with good health, then it's actually pretty fun to ride a bike in the rain. They're noticeably proud of it. They confidently say that a significant part of their good life includes having the freedom to bring their child to school on a bike, even in unfavorably bad weather. Meanwhile, there are Americans, more specifically the fervent Trump supporters, who advertise by exclaiming, "Look at these terribly misguided Europeans." Because back in Denmark, they've spun a narrative that even the hardworking middle class can't afford a car anymore and is now reduced to biking everywhere. They cruelly twist the narrative. So yes, those who are financially struggling Danes can't drive cars. They have no choice but to resort to biking. But in reality, Danes will tell you they're proud of it. That's really what it's all about. What are people proud of? And what do you enjoy? Driving is great, but if you're fit enough, a nice walk or bike ride is also something wonderful, isn't it? It's about reevaluating for yourself. What do you enjoy? Where do you feel good? That's always the point. What really is a good life? And it's like now, when the Greens came along, it was always said that they want to turn everyone into vegetarians. But now, many young people have already become vegans. I'm not sure if it's healthy, but they clearly feel good about it and are proud. It's about this new pride in a different approach. And it's really about not just technically saying more calories from this or no noodles or no animal products or something like that. It's never just about technical things. It's always about what that means for quality of life.
And for that, it requires visions and people who participate and who express how they would like things to be, what they fear, and what they wish for.
Yes, and if you don't keep that crucial detail in mind, then you passionately plan things with seemingly good intentions that unfortunately end up missing the vital mark. I mean, we all followed the frustrating situation with the poorly executed heating legislation. I always sternly told the ministry folks, you need to listen more to the invaluable opinions of the citizens beforehand. And then they always said, shrugging it off, we don't have time now. We have a new government. We need to govern quickly so that we can achieve this ambitious goal during our limited term in office. Regrettably, that's just wishful thinking. They wouldn't have necessarily needed to talk to all the citizens, but perhaps a focus group centered on heating would have just sufficed to say that you can't make the law work in practice as it stands. And that's what I'm precisely talking about, this, front loading, as McKinsey always said. You have to invest up front in processes. Before you even finish and begin to plan, you need to front load. Good information, solid opinions from all sides. Then you see where the problems are, where the resistance is, where you might need to do things differently. And if you want to skip this process, you're asking for trouble, especially if you want to change something. If you want to go backward, people hardly ever resist. Instead, they say it was nice. The good old family days and such, many people will agree that was nicer. Or everyone learning poems by heart again, that was also nicer. Or there were not so many migrants. Yes, that was nicer in many people's opinion. You can go backward with people, but moving forward where you need to go, that is hard. That's why you need to involve people.
And there you've just told us a lot about how this particular concept could work and why it's indeed a great idea. I firmly believe many dedicated listeners could take a lot away from that discussion. We could probably list more than 100 different practical examples to make this point even clearer. Currently, we are still relentlessly facing many crisis spots and critical problems that we urgently need to confront. And yet, even in all that you say, you continually convey a sense of overwhelming positivity. At the end of your book, you envision Europe in 100 years with positivity. What's the source of your optimism?
Well, I believe, firstly, there are different types of personalities who see the world differently. Some see the glass as either half full or half empty. I feel that tackling energy matters. It's an issue of perspective. In my view, this generally has to do with imagining or envisioning not that the world will turn into paradise, but rather that it can somehow improve. It's believing that one can solve problems. I take that to mean that I really believe, genuinely, this vast Europe of ours, we have many problems, and currently we're facing a great deal of intense refugee pressure. Above all, we are grappling with climate change, which, as I see it, is projected to increase temperatures by 2.5 degrees. This will inevitably cause widespread drought, flooding, and many other problems here in the next 100 years. However, I strongly believe that as we have the oldest democracies, and now with several states converging to form something akin to a unit, things should eventually work themselves out slowly over time. Now and then we observe someone leans more towards the right, but then there are others who promptly counteract. No matter what, I don't believe that Europe will succumb and become completely authoritarian. I hold firm to that belief. It's undeniably my great hope, even if elections go in ways I wouldn't wish for, such as presumably in France. I still can't see Europe becoming an authoritarian bloc. I fervently believe it will sometimes be more conservative, other times more left-leaning. I truly think we have good tools. And we've also started to seriously experiment at the EU level with engaging citizens, genuinely listening to their concerns. And then we have many unexpected demonstrations suddenly erupting from farmers where the EU also patiently listens. I think they might overreact at times and too hastily hand things out to the people, but still, regardless, they react. They don't come with the army and cruelly shoot the farmers dead. That could happen. In Russia, you can't go protest, you'd be put in prison. I believe the EU has great democratic potential. There's a consensus among us that we need a welfare state, even if it's not exactly as many would wish. There is also a prevailing consensus that companies should somehow grant basic rights, such as minimum wages and similar benefits. It's all still not perfect. There is a steadily growing consensus that we must somehow effectively integrate migrants into society. I firmly believe that the borders are becoming tougher. I do see a considerable fortification at the external borders, which certainly will not ease up in the near future. To make a long story short, I truly think that all this indicates that we in Europe can overcome these crises, even though life won't necessarily get any smoother. I sincerely believe our children and grandchildren will not have an easier life than we do right now. But the pressing question is, does a harder life, brought about by climate change and other significant factors, inevitably have to end in disaster? I really don't think so. When I was a child growing up in the 1950s, people lived more simply and had to overcome many daunting problems. I firmly believe humans can manage many things they face. The crucial part, however, is that they must consciously see themselves as active actors and not just as victims of everything that happens around them. That's a bit of our problem in Germany right now. Far too many people constantly think they are only victims. I mean, if we Germans are seen as the main victims, no doubt the rest of the world would probably have a bit of a hearty laugh. Travel around the world and see if we are truly the biggest victims of everything. That's simply, I must say, ridiculous. Although there are problems here, we are a well-established community. You can hardly say that anymore because many do not want to hear it. But I think it's true. Right up to healthcare, despite everything, we look at England, we look at America. But for example, Italy also has a decent healthcare system, even though it receives much less money. To make a long story short, I hope Europe will not perish in a great war. I don't believe it will, even though there are dangers. And I believe it will somehow remain democratic. And I think there will be more participation than there is today. And yet there will still be evil people and criminals and sometimes a right-wing and sometimes a left-wing government. And I believe the danger that they will keep pushing back against climate change, meaning the policies to fight it, is real out of fear of the people. And for that reason, it will become even more expensive and even harder. But I think we will manage this reasonably well. Nonetheless, it will simply be much hotter and unnecessarily so. Had we grasped this earlier, much of what is now going to happen, which we can no longer stop, would not occur.
Gisela, you have implemented this concept of citizens' councils in Baden-Württemberg. How likely do you think it is that this will gain traction on a federal level and be implemented?
Oh, thank you for the intriguing question. Yes, so I actually forgot to mention that this innovative concept is now being rolled out internationally. In Ireland, it's been quite remarkable with controversial issues like the Catholic Church suddenly approving abortion and same-sex marriage, which was facilitated through active citizens' councils. Over in France, there have been large citizens' councils on pressing climate issues where President Macron has diligently implemented a lot, not everything, and he is always widely criticized for that. But truthfully, he has implemented a great deal. And he has now created a large citizens' council for assisted dying. And he's finally turning it into law since, like in Germany, the churches and such were always very opposed to it. The population is in favor of relaxing the laws on these issues, and now they will do so. In Austria, there are citizens' councils. Across Europe, at the local level, there are thousands of citizens' councils. In Germany, it's being done on a more ad hoc basis, and I believe it's spreading through the municipalities. In urban planning, it's quite strong and sporadic on a state level. And now, which I also consider partly my success and that of others, it's in the coalition agreement of the government that we will have these citizens' councils at the federal level. The CDU, which was actually instrumental in introducing it under Schäuble, is now suddenly saying they don't like the instrument, calling it a substitute parliament. I don't believe this criticism will last because people just don't understand it. Nobody thinks a citizens' council replaces a parliament. No one believes that except for the CDU, and the FDP and the AfD would rather have referendums. So I believe our competence in such forms of participation has increased 100-fold in Europe over the last 10 years. And people working in administrations now have a lot more knowledge about this and do it much more often. And I firmly believe that politics is becoming more engaged actively. That's my fervent hope, even though there are always people who assert, no, we don't need all that. We just need the parties. But it's clear as day that the parties alone cannot do it all comprehensively. That's why I'm so optimistic that this will not only spread in Germany, but all across the entirety of Europe. Spain is far along. Ireland is substantially far along. France is impressively far along. It varies, but I believe we're on the right track. It's not only about citizens' councils, but also about open ears to listen and respond. Then perhaps others will suggest alternatives.
Many thanks, dear Gisela, for taking the time to share your experiences with us. Once again, I highly recommend the book at this juncture, Democracy in Turbulent Times, Advocating for Politics of Being Heard, Political Memoirs, released on April 8th by Herder Publishing, and we'll link it again in the show notes. I bid you farewell and extend my sincere thanks.
Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you so much, and I truly wish you enjoy listening, or honestly hope you enjoyed it. And I sincerely wish you a great day, tomorrow or evening, depending on when you're listening to this special episode.